It was the winter of 1964, a February that felt colder than any living soul in Harlem could remember. The wind whipped off the Hudson River, cutting through wool coats and freezing the slush in the gutters into jagged gray ice. But the real chill wasn't in the air. It was in the streets. Harlem was divided, a kingdom tearing itself apart. On one side stood the Nation of Islam, disciplined, angry, and feeling betrayed. On the other, the growing flock of Malcolm X, the Red, who had dared to speak his truth and leave the fold. And watching it all from the penthouse of the chaotic skyscraper that was Harlem stood Bumpy Johnson. He was older now, the gray touching his temples, his movements less like a panther and more like a mountain, immovable, ancient, and undeniably dangerous. February 14th, 1964, 3 a.m. The basement of a nondescript dry cleaner on 116th Street smelled of starch, damp concrete, and the distinct copper tang of terror. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling, casting a pendulum of light across the face of a young man tied to a wooden chair. His name was elusive. Maybe Brother Thomas, maybe just a kid from Queens with a burning desire to prove his loyalty to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It didn't matter. What mattered was that 4 hours ago, he had been sitting in a parked car outside the Hotel Teresa with a loaded .38 caliber revolver and a photograph of Malcolm X taped to the dashboard. Now, he was looking into the abyss. Bumpy Johnson sat in the shadows, cleaning his fingernails with a small penknife. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a weary uncle, dressed in a pristine three-piece suit that seemed to defy the basement's filth. He hadn't touched the boy. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply let the silence do the work. The silence of Bumpy Johnson was heavier than lead. It crushed the lungs and squeezed the heart. "You know who I am, son?" Bumpy asked, his voice a low rumble like a subway train passing underground. The boy nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Yes, sir. You're Mr. Johnson." "Mr. Johnson," Bumpy repeated, tasting the words. "That's polite. I like polite. Politeness keeps people alive." He finally looked up, his eyes hard and unreadable. "You were going to do something stupid tonight, something that can't be undone. You were going to shoot a man who is the voice of this community, a man who, whether you agree with him or not, belongs to Harlem." "He's a traitor," the boy spat out, the indoctrination overriding his fear for a fleeting second. "He speaks against the messenger." Bumpy stood up. The movement was so sudden yet so fluid that the boy flinched violently. Bumpy walked over and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. It wasn't a grip of aggression. It was the heavy hand of reality. "There are no traitors here, son. Just men trying to find their way in the dark. But you're just a pawn. And I don't kill pawns. It's messy. It's beneath me." Bumpy reached into his breast pocket. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the cold steel of a muzzle. Instead, he felt paper brush against his cheek. He opened his eyes to see a train ticket and a thick envelope stuffed with cash tucked into his shirt pocket. "One way. To Chicago," Bumpy said softly. "The train leaves in 2 hours. You're going to get on it. You're going to go to your aunt's house. Yes, I know where she lives. And you're going to get a job. You're going to forget you ever owned a gun. Because if I ever see your face in New York again, if I even hear a whisper that you've crossed the Hudson, I won't be this kind. I will bury you so deep the devil himself won't find you." He cut the ropes. The boy didn't run. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the bizarre mixture of mercy and menace. Bumpy Johnson, the man whose name was synonymous with violence, had chosen to save a life to protect a friend. As the boy scrambled up the stairs and into the night, Bumpy lit a cigarette, the flare illuminating a face etched with a profound sadness. He wasn't just fighting rival gangs anymore. He was fighting history. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X was the greatest paradox of Harlem. The criminal and the prophet. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the fires of systemic oppression. They had walked the streets together when Malcolm was still Detroit Red, a hustler playing the numbers. Now, Malcolm was walking toward martyrdom, and Bumpy was the only one who seemed to see the cliff edge approaching. Bumpy respected Malcolm's transformation. He saw the purity in him, a righteousness that Bumpy knew he himself had lost long ago, or perhaps never had. But purity was a shield made of glass. It shattered easily. A week later, the two men met at the 22 West restaurant. It was neutral ground, a place where the clinking of silverware drowned out the whispers of conspiracies. The date was February 21st, exactly 1 year before the end. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried chicken. Malcolm sat upright, his posture rigid, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked tired, the weight of the split with the nation carving deep lines around his eyes. Bumpy sat opposite him, sipping a scotch, his eyes darting to the door every time it opened. "You need to let me put men on you, Red," Bumpy said, using the old nickname, an anchor to their shared past. "I have heard the whispers. The fruit of Islam is rotting. They are going to move on you. Not if, but when." Malcolm shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "I can't, Bumpy. You know I can't. I am building something new, something spiritual. If I am seen surrounded by your men, men with guns, men of the street, it validates everything the press says about me. It validates everything the nation says, that I am a thug, that I haven't changed. You haven't changed, Red. You just woke up." Bumpy leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss. "But listen to me. A dead prophet can't lead. A dead man can't build a mosque. I can have 4 men invisible around you 24/7. They won't see them. You won't see them. But they will stop the bullets." "Violence begets violence," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but weary. "I cannot preach self-defense and dignity while hiding behind the skirts of the underworld. My protection comes from Allah." Bumpy laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He took a long drink of his scotch. "Allah is busy, Malcolm, and the devil is working overtime. Look at me. What do you see? You see a criminal, a sinner. I accept that. But the world needs men like me. We are the immune system. We do the dirty work so the body can survive." He pointed a finger at Malcolm, his expression fierce. "You want to walk in the light? Fine, but someone has to stand in the dark and hold back the monsters. Let me be your monster, Red. Let me do what I do best so you can do what you do best." Malcolm reached across the table and placed his hand over Bumpy's. It was a gesture of brotherhood that transcended their divergent paths. "I know you love me, brother, and I love you. But I must walk this path alone. If I fall, let it be because I stood tall, not because I was propped up by the gun." Bumpy pulled his hand away, frustration warring with admiration in his chest. He knew, in that moment, that he was looking at a dead man. He was a grand master looking at a board where the opponent had already declared mate. But his king refused to move out of check. The tragedy wasn't that Bumpy couldn't save him. It was that Malcolm wouldn't let him. For the next year, Bumpy became a ghost in Malcolm's life. He couldn't put guards on him, so he waged a silent war in the sewers of New York. Every rumor of a hit was investigated. Every potential assassin was visited. Bones were broken in alleyways. Bribes were paid in back rooms. Threats were whispered in the ears of captains and lieutenants. Bumpy Johnson, The godfather of Harlem spent a fortune and risked his empire to buy his friend time. He was the invisible shield, deflecting the arrows that he could see. But he couldn't stop the tide. Then came February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom. Bumpy wasn't there. He couldn't be. Malcolm had specifically asked him to stay away, to keep the event pure. Bumpy was at the uptown apartment, sitting by the radio, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. He felt it before he heard it. A disturbance in the ether. A sudden silence in the roar of the city. When the news broke over the airwaves, flash, Malcolm X shot, multiple wounds, critical condition. Bumpy didn't scream. He didn't throw his glass. He simply closed his eyes and lowered his head. The King of Harlem sat alone in his castle, utterly defeated. All the power, all the money, all the fear he inspired, it amounted to nothing against the stubborn resolve of a martyr. He had cleared the board of pawns, but he couldn't stop the knights from jumping the line. Later that night, the streets of Harlem were on fire with grief and rage. People were crying, screaming, looking for someone to blame. Bumpy stood on the corner of 125th Street watching the chaos. A young lieutenant ran up to him, breathless, eyes wild. "Bumpy! Bumpy, they got him! What do we do? Do we burn it down? Do we go after the mosque?" Bumpy looked at the young man, his eyes cold and distant as the Hudson in winter. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Go home. Lock your doors." "But Bumpy, it's Malcolm." "I know who it is," Bumpy roared, the facade finally cracking, revealing the raw, bleeding wound beneath. "I know who it is better than any of you. But he didn't want a war. He didn't want blood in the streets for his name. If we turn this city into a slaughterhouse tonight, we kill him twice." He turned and walked away, moving through the crowd like a phantom. He walked past the Apollo, past the corner store, past the places where they used to hustle as kids. He was the bad man who had offered to carry the sin so the good man could ascend. But the good man had refused the offer. The legend of Bumpy Johnson is often painted in blood and heroin, a story of ruthless ambition. But the real story, the one whispered by the old heads who were there, is a tragedy of love. It is the story of a man who ruled a kingdom of wolves, but couldn't save the one shepherd he truly loved. Bumpy Johnson died 3 years later in 1968 of a heart attack. Some say his heart gave out from the stress of the life, but others, those who saw him that night in February 1965, believe that Bumpy's heart didn't stop in 1968. It broke in the Audubon Ballroom, and it just took 3 years for his body to realize it. So when you think of the civil rights movement, when you think of the speeches and the marches, remember the shadow behind the light. Remember the man who sat in the dark, tying a boy to a chair, handing him a ticket to life, just to buy his friend one more day of breath. The world needed Malcolm X to dream of a better future. But maybe, just maybe, Malcolm X needed Bumpy Johnson to survive the present. The question remains for us, sitting in the comfort of history's distance. Is it better to die a martyr with clean hands, or live as a sinner who kept the wolves at bay? Bumpy made his choice. Malcolm made his. And Harlem wept for them both.